James Garner, who was 85 years old at the time, suddenly disclosed a painful fact that he had been keeping hidden for many years. Neither fame nor fortune nor even Hollywood politics were at stake in this situation. It was about Doris Day, a woman who was admired all around the world. What he stated about her was so shocking that even his closest buddies were taken aback. There were very few couples who were able to light up the silver screen in the same way that James Garner and Doris Day did in the early 1960s. In movies such as The Thrill of It All and Move Over, Darling, audiences fell in love with the actors because of their impeccable comedic timing, flirty banter, and irresistible chemistry inside the character. They were gorgeous, charming, and appeared to be in perfect harmony, making them the ideal couple for comedies that were lighthearted and romantic in nature. However, despite the fact that the public liked them during their time together, the truth behind the scenes was much less polished. Some members of the team whispered that things were not quite as warm between the two stars as the final cuts claimed they were. This occurred even as the filming was taking place. Garner was renowned for being straightforward, low maintenance, and not one to play Hollywood games while she was in the industry. Doris Day, on the other hand, was regarded as the most beautiful woman in the United States of America. This image was meticulously crafted, and according to Garner himself, it did not necessarily correspond to her behavior behind the camera. Different parts of the industry were represented by these individuals. The Garner Day, the wholesome movie office darling who was fashioned by studios that expected her to be perfect at all times, and the gruff television star who went on to become a leading man. Garner would subsequently indicate that working with Day was anything but thrilling, despite the fact that their first collaboration, The Thrill of It All, was a commercial triumph. When he was asked about her in interviews years later, he would smile sweetly and offer praise that was carefully selected. However, his private notebooks painted a different picture. He made a list of the things that happened on set that irritated him, and he made frequent references to what he referred to as Day's intentional charm. One of the entries from that time period that is very illuminating is that she is aware of how to get what she wants, and that she is aware of when to act innocent. It is the risky aspect of the situation. Simply by itself, the statement presents a picture that is significantly more complicated than the one that Hollywood attempted to sell through press tours and commercial photographs. What is even more illuminating is the fact that Garner kept returning to the topic of Day in his works. It was as if something about their professional relationship had left an effect that was much more profound than he was willing to accept. Due to the fact that studio officials are constantly cognizant of how the public perceives them, they embraced the notion that Garner and Day were close friends. They utilized their chemistry to drive ticket sales by forcing them to pose together off-set, fabricating amusing interviews, and using their chemistry. It did work for a period of time. Garner's quiet on Day became more evident as the years passed, yet she continued to remain silent. Garner's name was noticeably absent from the anecdotes that her co-stars and directors spoke about their experiences working with her. In return, he rarely brought her up until he was specifically prodded to do so. Moreover, even in that case, his praise was brief and somewhat clinical. Exactly what went wrong between them is the question. The question that needs to be answered is why a man who was friendly with almost everyone in Hollywood becomes so chilly toward Doris Day. Those who were close to Garner claimed that everything started with a single day spent working on set, a single event that would leave him feeling as though he had been taken by surprise and ultimately deceived. In addition, the events that transpired at that very moment would serve as a foundation for everything that would follow. Things took a drastic turn during the filming of Move Over, Darling, which was what caused the dramatic shift. Despite his reputation as a professional, James Garner insisted on performing the majority of his own stunts. He was of the opinion that it elevated the sincerity of his performances. In addition to having established a reputation for being someone who was willing to put himself in harm's way for a nice take. On the other hand, there was a certain scene that went beyond the boundaries of that reputation and revealed something about Doris Day that he would never forget. As part of the sequence, Garner was obliged to carry out a physical gag that involved a bathtub, a floor that was slick, and a fall that was not timed correctly. On paper, it was a typical example of slapstick in romantic comedies. In point of fact, it was significantly more hazardous than anyone had anticipated. Garner had a dislocated shoulder and torn ligaments as a result of an awkward landing that occurred during the shot. He had slipped more forcefully than he had expected. The production was paused, the crew hurried in, and the cameras were turned off. Nevertheless, the injury itself was not the thing that stayed with Garner the most. It was Doris Day's response to the situation. Day was said to have moved very little, according to various accounts from the set. As members of the team rushed around the actor who had fallen, she stood there, completely detached and uninterested. It was said by some that she turned away. Garner would subsequently describe her demeanor as one of disinterest and detachment. Others claimed that she merely observed the situation. Garner appeared to be in a state of shock, but no one could say for certain what she was thinking at that precise time. The least he could have hoped for was a sign of care, a brief check-in, or anything similar, but he stated that it never materialized. Later on in his memoirs, Garner recalled the circumstance with a precision that was out of the ordinary. The pain was so severe that I was unable to move my shoulder as I lay on the floor. I can so vividly recall glancing up and seeing Doris standing there by herself. There is nothing in her eyes. Not to worry about it. There was no response. To me, that conveyed more than any words could ever say. The depth of the hurt was shown by that sentence more than by any rumor or gossip column that could have been published in a tabloid. Day was questioned about the incident in interviews that took place several years later. In the same manner that she normally does, she laughed it off and said that Garner was a tough guy. She then brushed it off carelessly. For some reason, Garner never laughed it off. Several days of filming were missed by him, and he was obliged to undergo physical rehabilitation for several months later. It took some time for the pain in his body to go away. On the other hand, he asserts that the injury to his pride, and more crucially, to his opinion of Doris Day, never occurred. There were many who were on the inside who asserted that Day was simply overwhelmed and that she became frozen in the moment. The other people assumed that she was irritated by the long hours and that all she wanted to do was make it through the day. On the other hand, Garner was under the impression that it was something different. There is something chillier. His impression was that she saw the situation as a nuisance rather than a crisis. Moreover, once he had come to that conclusion, there was no turning back. From that point forward, their interactions were polite but reserved for the most part. It was meticulously kept for the cameras that the warmth that the viewers believed in was preserved, but as the director yelled, "Cut," the coldness between them became evident. In spite of the fact that Garner had always taken great satisfaction in being easy to collaborate with, he found himself withdrawing. Furthermore, despite the fact that he never explicitly questioned her about it, he carried the memory of that quiet with him for decades. Not only did it mark a turning point in their working relationship, but it also marked a turning point in Garner's perception of Day as a person. In spite of the fact that he never made a public spectacle or engaged in a scandalous interview, he would later claim that the event taught him everything he needed to know about her true nature. Furthermore, from that point on, every choice he made in relation to her would be influenced by that conviction. Following the success of their first two films together, studios were keen to cast James Garner and Doris Day in another film because of their close relationship. The audience adored them, as evidenced by the box office results, and the combination of their names almost certainly ensured that they would be successful. However, there was one project that was so eagerly anticipated that it would never be completed. In addition, the events that took place behind the scenes caused a rift between them that has never been repaired. In the meantime, Garner had already committed to the project, and production was proceeding when it was reported that Doris Day had abruptly withdrawn from the project. There was no prior warning or explanation. It was simply a silent withdrawal that left the producers in a state of confusion and Garner caught off guard. Reportedly, he had advocated for Day to be cast in the role, on the grounds that he believed their previous chemistry would ensure the film's continued success. The abruptness of her departure seemed to be more than just a scheduling difficulty. It had a personal touch. A number of individuals who were close to the production stated that Garner was furious. This made him feel ashamed. An individual on whom he believed he could at least rely professionally put him in a precarious position. To make matters even worse, there were allegations that Day had struck a private contract with another studio for a solo movie that was in direct opposition to the one that Garner had committed to. Whether it was an attempt to avoid working with him again or a desire to increase the amount of money they made, the outcome was the same. As a result, Garner was left holding the bag. He later stated that the stillness was the thing that hurt him the most. No phone contact, no apology, and no explanation were provided. Nothing more than a quiet exit, as if the movie and his participation in it meant absolutely nothing at all. According to his friends, he took the move personally and interpreted it as a direct indication that Day no longer cared about having any kind of relationship with him. From that point on, it was reported that Garner started declining scripts that included her name linked to them. He had no desire to go through that experience once more. Over the course of many years, the general public was never aware of any of this. Creative disputes were cited as the reason for the film's cancellation, which was announced in a low-key manner. Nevertheless, the aftermath was a real thing behind the scenes. Despite the fact that Garner maintained his pleasant demeanor in public, his private comments revealed a very different tale. Garner further distanced himself from any relationship with Day. Garner's response was succinct and direct when he was posed the question decades later about whether or not he would ever work with her again. "I had enough of it once." An answer that was heavy with meaning came from a guy who rarely talked in absolutes, and that wordless rejection marked the point where there was no turning back. The year 1976 marked the publication of Doris Day's autobiography, which was a glossy memoir that became a bestseller and depicted her life in soft pastels. The film received acclaim from fans for its vulnerability and endearing qualities, and for many of them, it was the closest they had ever come to truly understanding Doris. She related tales of her childhood, her troubled marriages, and the challenges she faced as a result of her celebrity. Although it was wide in tone, the content was narrowly focused. And according to James Garner, the book disclosed more about what it did not divulge than it did about what it did show. Day barely made a cursory reference to Garner throughout the more than 300 pages. A few words of praise on how lovely it was to collaborate with him are all that is required. No anecdotes, no recollections that they had in common, and no indication of a deeper connection or tension from the past. The absence of someone who had starred opposite her in two of her most successful films was a glaring omission. To Garner, it appeared to be a purposeful attempt to erase something. In private, he was raging with rage. He had anticipated that at the very least some portion of the years that they had spent working together on set, including the highs, the lows, and everything in between, would be acknowledged. The reality was, however, that it appeared as though he had been completely removed from her narrative. According to those who were close to him, he felt insulted and even mocked by the fact that she gave him such little room. A man who had been a significant part of two of her most legendary performances was now hardly more than a footnote in her career. What made the situation even more difficult for Garner was the fact that the book was full of fond memories of other performers who had worked with her in the past, like Rock Hudson, Cary Grant, and even some lesser-known actors who had only collaborated with her once. It is not only that Garner was left out. Because of that particular absence, he was singled out. It wasn't only the things that she didn't actually say. Instead of talking about himself, she decided to talk about him. Although Garner was not the type to seek attention, he placed a high value on being truthful. He was of the opinion that stories should be recounted in all of their muddled condition, not only the parts that made someone look nice in their own eyes. The book that Day had written, in his opinion, had been meticulously crafted and sculpted in order to maintain a public image that left little opportunity for truths that were problematic. From his perspective, she had assumed command of the story, and she had done so by discreetly removing the portions of the story that did not correspond to the neatly painted portrait she had created. On the other hand, when Garner published his own autobiography many years later, he added a chapter that discussed his time spent working within the company of Day. Despite the fact that it was not sour, it was utterly forthcoming. He stated that their connection off-camera was strained, polite, and primarily professional, but he regarded their on-screen chemistry as being genuine. He stated in his writing that he had never completely understood her, and that whenever they were alone together, he always had the impression that something was off-kilter. Unresolved tension that lingered like a question that was never answered was the only thing that existed. There was no malice. The fact that their two accounts were so drastically different simply served to widen the gap between them. During the time that Day's followers were praising her book, Garner's words came as a quiet thunderclap, which was both unexpected and unnerving. It was seen by some as the ultimate dig. Some people interpreted it as a man finally coming clean after years of trying to maintain appearances at all costs. It was more than that, however, for those who were aware of the manner in which he had maintained that silence for decades. Despite the fact that it was delayed, it was a true ending. In addition, it was obvious to those who were able to read between the lines. Garner was under the impression that Doris Day had rewrote history and excluded him when she did so. In addition, once the course of history had been altered, there was no way to go back in time. When it came to Hollywood in the past, quiet was frequently more powerful than scandal. In the instance of James Garner and Doris Day, the fact that their acquaintances who were also acquainted with each other did not speak out told its own narrative. There were very few instances in which actors, producers, and directors who had collaborated with both stars commented on their relationship. No, it was not simply a matter of respect. The reason for this was that nobody wanted to get involved in something about which they did not have a complete understanding. When the subject of Garner was brought up, Rock Hudson, who is considered to be one of Day's closest friends, behaved in an especially reserved manner. Despite the fact that he had collaborated with both celebrities and was frequently seen as the transitional link between their respective worlds, he never provided any explanation for what went wrong. Because of this quiet, conjecture was only fanned. Particularly with regard to off-camera disagreements that were never reported in the tabloids, there were those who suspected that Hudson knew more than he let on. Another member of Day's circle did the same thing. The directors who had worked on her films praised her for her warmth and charm, but they cleverly left out Garner when they were reminiscing about her. In the meantime, Garner, who is known for being open and honest, decided to exercise restraint. That was illuminating in and of itself. The tone of his voice changed when he was speaking about Doris, but he would say what he thought of almost everyone else in Hollywood. Frustration was present, to be sure, but there was also anything more substantial, such as dissatisfaction or possibly even despair. Rumors began to circulate over time. There were a few people who suspected that the conflict between Garner and Day may have been caused by personal factors in addition to a professional disagreement, a failed romantic relationship, a private quarrel, or a broken promise. Even after they had ceased working together for a number of years, many who were close to both celebrities recognized that the energy between them was complicated. However, no one could verify this with absolute certainty. The manner in which Day continued to be honored in Hollywood was responsible for adding still another layer of mystery to the situation. Her legacy was celebrated on multiple occasions, and she was lauded as one of the last great icons of a bygone era. Garner did not raise any objections in public, but according to sources, he was irritated by the ease with which she appeared to avoid criticism. Once upon a time, a friend of Garner's recalled that she had the ability to enchant the entire globe, but that charm never worked on Jim again. It was impossible to challenge Day's position in the court of public opinion. Garner, on the other hand, was burdened by the burden of an unresolved history that no one wanted to discuss. And despite the fact that he never made an effort to bring her down, he also never let go of the notion that something significant between them had been left unsaid, and that the stillness would continue until the very end. Even after several decades had passed, James Garner continued to be a revered figure in the entertainment industry. He was graceful in his aging process, quiet in his retirement, and cherished by fans who remembered him as a leading man who never followed the rules. He chose to spend his later years in a more secluded setting, which largely resulted in him removing himself from the public eye. However, Garner finally addressed the one name that has clouded his legacy for decades, Doris Day, when he was 85 years old, when he gave an interview that very few people anticipated and even fewer people were prepared for. A confessional was not intended to be the purpose of the interview. It started out as a retrospective, a look back at a career that was full of history. When the topic of discussion shifted to the golden age of romantic comedies, the interviewer made a passing reference to Day in a manner that was almost superficial. Garner was silent for a brief period of time. Following that, he let out a sigh and uttered things that would startle even those who were closest to him. She was never really forgiven by me. Not a single word was spoken with rage. Almost depressing, it was a time of quiet reflection. Garner emphasized that the notion of forgiveness had never been about the accident that occurred on set, the film that was canceled, or even the erasing that occurred in her memoir. Beyond that, it was about something more profound, a breach of trust. Even though she was aware of what she had done, she never once admitted to having done it. Even a phone call, not a single word was heard. He recognized that he had harbored the resentment for a longer period of time than he ought to have, and that it had persisted not because of harboring hatred, but rather because of harboring sorrow. He stated that we had the potential to become something outstanding, not only on the screen, but possibly even off of it as well. However, she shut that door, and I was never given the opportunity to inquire as to the reason for her decision. When the interviewer heard the confession, they were taken aback. It was not the traditional Hollywood grudge, nor was it the raging quarrel that tabloids loved to embellish because of their popularity. It was a wound that had never healed because the person who created it had never acknowledged that it existed. It was something that was colder and quieter. Fans and fellow actors displayed a range of emotions in response to Garner's statements. In defense of Day, there were many who insisted that she must have had her reasons. Other people were able to identify with Garner's feelings of abandonment because they recognized in his statements a lifetime of suppressing emotions. However, the confession was never intended to be the beginning of a battle. Simply put, it was a man who was getting close to the end of his life and telling the truth by the way he saw it. The issue was concluded with a sentence that remained in the air for a considerable amount of time after the interview was over. People who you least anticipate to be the ones to cause you the greatest pain are often the ones who do. By that point, it was already far too late for either of them to rectify the situation. In 2019, when Doris Day passed away, tributes were pouring in from all around the world after her passing. She was recalled as a shining star, a voice that would never go out of style, and a shining example of the golden age of Hollywood. The news of her passing evoked feelings of both melancholy and reverence. But for James Garner, who had passed away only a few years previously, it left behind a story that was never going to be resolved since it was never properly concluded. Despite the fact that it was a quiet confession, Garner's revelation had shed new light on their legacy. Rewatching beloved flicks, fans started looking for hints of stress that were not immediately obvious, wanting to know what had actually transpired behind those jovial smiles and the impeccable timing of the humorous delivery. However, everything that had been between them, including hurt, misunderstanding, and hatred, passed away along with them. There would be no apology, no letter would be found, and there would be no reconciliation at the 11th hour. There was no way to open the door again. Biographers and film historians have spent the years that have passed since the event in an attempt to put together what went wrong. The rift, according to others, was professional in nature. Some people believe that it may be traced back to a clash of personalities and unacknowledged egos, while others believe that it was a personal, possibly even romantic, and more vulnerable matter that neither of the stars ever wanted to mention in public. However, the truth continues to be elusive. The later statements made by Garner were never addressed by Doris Day. Regarding whether or not she ever even heard them, it is not apparent. In her later years, she had become notoriously secretive, giving interviews only on a very infrequent basis and concentrating mostly on her work advocating for animals. It was already too late for Garner to make her first public appearance by the time she eventually opened up. She never expressed any regrets, if she did have any at all. The riddle continues to be a mystery. A legacy that is as dazzling as it is unfinished was left behind by two of Hollywood's biggest stars, who were permanently linked by two classic films and decades of speculation from behind the scenes. The on-screen chemistry between them was genuine. In that regard, there is no dispute. On the other hand, the distance that exists behind the curtain reveals a more eerie tale of lost opportunities, wounded pride, and a stillness that shouted more than any screenplay could ever have. It's possible that, in the end, it wasn't about whom to blame. One possible explanation is that it was about two individuals who were molded by a profession that expected perfection, false smiles, and silence in the face of sorrow. Despite the fact that what they revealed on TV brought happiness to millions of people, the things that they did not say convey a very different narrative, one that may never be fully comprehended. It's possible that this is the most human aspect of anything.